We begin tonight with a stunning discovery deep beneath the ocean waves.
Divers have what appears to be a
On January 28, 1986, the world watched in horror as the Challenger exploded just moments after liftoff. 7 brave astronauts vanished amid flames and debris. But what truly happened to their bodies?
Along with the rest of the orbiter, Challenger's crew cabin will also be buried here. NASA says that 90% of it was recovered after it plunged intact to the ocean surface. The impact shattered the cabin and is believed to be what killed the astronaut.
The details are haunting, shrouded in tragedy and mystery, revealing a grim reality few have fully confronted. Let's dive in. The launch that captured America. The morning of January 28, 1986, felt like a moment made for history. The air over Cape Canaveral was cold and sharp. The sky was a deep electric blue, and the sun shone bright on the launch pad. Families sat in bleachers wrapped in warm jackets. Many of them held small American flags. Children waved handmade signs. Reporters filled the press area. Millions of people across the country were watching live on television, especially in schools where teachers had wheeled in TVs for their students. This was not just another mission. It was STS-51L, the Challenger mission that carried Krista McAuliffe, a social studies teacher from New Hampshire. She had won her seat through the Teacher in Space program, a national contest that had captured the imagination of the entire country. She was not a career astronaut. She was a teacher, someone ordinary people felt connected to. The rest of the crew were experienced NASA astronauts. Commander Francis Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair, along with payload specialist Gregory Jarvis. Together they represented skill, courage, and the spirit of exploration. The crew walked out to the shuttle with smiles and waves, unaware of the danger hidden in the right solid rocket booster on the launch pad behind them. Even before liftoff, small warnings existed. Overnight temperatures had fallen lower than any previous shuttle launch day. Ice had formed on parts of the launch pad. Engineers had expressed worries about the cold affecting the rubber O-ring seals inside the booster joints. The O-rings were designed to be flexible, but in freezing conditions, they became hard and slow to seal. Still, the decision was made to go ahead. At 11:38 a.m., the final countdown reached 0. The main engines ignited, filling the air with steam and smoke. The shuttle rose slowly at first, then climbed into the bright sky. Cheers erupted from the crowd. For 73 seconds, Challenger climbed beautifully. Television anchors spoke excitedly. Children clapped as the bright trail painted across the morning sky. Then everything changed in an instant. People stared upward, confused, hoping the shuttle would reappear. It never did. What fell into the Atlantic moments later began a far darker chapter of the Challenger story: shock, confusion, and the first search. For a few terrible seconds after the explosion, no one truly understood what they had witnessed. The sky above Cape Canaveral showed 2 long white trails curling away from each other, drifting like broken ribbons in the cold air. To many of the families watching from the bleachers, it looked strange, but not immediately catastrophic. Some parents told their children it might be part of the mission. In classrooms across the United States, students clapped, believing the shuttle had simply separated into stages. Inside Mission Control in Houston, the atmosphere changed instantly. Telemetry data froze. Screens flickered. Voices overlapped on the headsets as controllers tried to make sense of the sudden loss of signals. Years of training kept everyone calm, but the silence in the room was filled with dread. The words spoken by Flight Director Jay Green were careful, measured, and heavy. Obviously, a major malfunction. No one wanted to be the first to say the unthinkable. Only minutes later, as television networks replayed the explosion again and again, it became clear this was a disaster. News anchors struggled to describe what they were seeing. Some stopped speaking mid-sentence, visibly shaken. NASA officials quickly ended the live broadcast from the press site and retreated to closed rooms. Out at sea, the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy were already scrambling into action. Helicopters took off. Cutters and rescue boats raced toward the area where the falling debris had disappeared into the Atlantic. The search stretched across miles of ocean. Boats moved in grid patterns, scanning for anything that might indicate survival, such as floating helmets, life rafts, or signal beacons. Divers prepared to enter the cold water. But the Atlantic showed only fragments. Soon, pieces of Challenger began surfacing. Insulation, shredded wiring, lightweight debris, and scorched sections of the orbiter's outer skin. Back on land, NASA representatives spoke briefly to the press, still clinging to formal words about search and rescue. But inside the closed doors of Mission Control, they understood the truth. The explosion had occurred at almost 48,000 feet. As the day turned to evening, the searchlights from the ships illuminated the waves. The water was calmer than expected, as if holding its breath. And deep beneath the surface, lying somewhere in the cold darkness, parts of Challenger had already settled on the ocean floor. But within days, sonar teams would detect something far larger and far more important than scattered debris, a discovery that would change the entire investigation. The grim recovery begins. In the days after the explosion, the Atlantic Ocean became the center of one of the largest recovery missions in NASA's history. The operation quickly shifted from hope to grim determination. The U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force, and NASA formed a massive joint effort, bringing together ships, aircraft, deep-sea equipment, and hundreds of specialists. Their new mission was not rescue, it was reconstruction. The ocean off Florida's coast is deceptively shallow, only about 100 feet in many places. But that made the work harder. Debris did not sink into deep, isolated trenches. It spread widely across the seabed, scattering into tangled fields of metal. Sonar ships scanned the water, sending out constant pings that echoed back ghostly shapes. Some shapes were small fragments. Others were large sections of the shuttle. Every strange signal had to be checked by divers or underwater vehicles. Surface recovery began first. Coast Guard vessels collected floating pieces, insulation tiles, torn metal panels, shattered tubing, sections of the payload bay doors, and fragments of the external tank. Each piece was tagged, photographed, and stored. Navy helicopters circled overhead, taking images to map the drifting debris. What floated was only a fraction of Challenger's remains. Below the waves, the real work waited. Navy divers descended again and again, often in cold, murky water where visibility dropped to a few feet. They followed neon markers and fluorescent dye that outlined the most important areas. Beneath them lay a metallic graveyard, parts of engines, wiring, panels, and twisted structural beams. Some pieces were as small as hands. Others weighed hundreds of pounds. As more wreckage was raised to the surface, ships began delivering it to a large hangar at Kennedy Space Center. Engineers there created a massive reconstruction floor, laying pieces on steel frames shaped like the outline of the orbiter. Part by part, Challenger was reassembled like a puzzle for investigators. Burn patterns were examined. Fracture lines were traced. Every detail mattered, because every detail was a clue. By early February, recovery teams had lifted thousands of fragments from the sea. More than 100 tons of material were eventually recovered, nearly half of Challenger's entire mass. But something was still missing, something crucial. The part that could answer the most painful questions. The crew compartment had not been found. When divers reached this mysterious object on the seafloor, they realized they had found the most heartbreaking piece of all: discovery of the crew compartment. On March 7, 1986, more than 5 weeks after the disaster, the recovery operation reached a turning point. A Navy sonar sweep detected a large, irregular object on the seabed, roughly 18 miles east of Cape Canaveral. It was deeper than most previous finds and half buried in sand. The shape stood out immediately. It was too large, too intact, and too heavy to be just another piece of the external tank or booster. The moment the readings came in, divers were deployed. As the dive team descended, the water grew darker and colder. Their floodlights cut through the murk, revealing shifting shadows. Slowly, the outline of the object came into view. What they saw stopped them completely. It was not a wing segment, nor engine hardware, nor a chunk of fuselage. For weeks, people across NASA and the military had whispered that the cabin might still be intact somewhere in the ocean. Now that theory became a painful reality. Though heavily damaged, crushed, and torn open in several places, enough remained to identify it immediately. The windows were shattered, the walls crumpled, and parts of the frame were twisted beyond recognition, but the structure was unmistakable. This was where Challenger's crew had spent their last moments. When the wreckage finally broke through the waves, the deck fell silent. Navy and NASA officials stood in a quiet line as the remains were transferred aboard. There was no cheering, no noise, no relief, only respect and grief. The ship carrying the cabin maintained strict security, refusing all media access. A flag was raised above the recovered structure. Once transported to Kennedy Space Center, the cabin was moved to a secure hangar. There, teams of engineers, pathologists, and investigators examined it carefully. Their analysis confirmed what the mission footage and telemetry had already suggested. The cabin had separated from the shuttle in a single piece during the explosion. Instead of disintegrating immediately, it had continued moving upward to about 65,000 feet, before arcing downward in a long, deadly fall, lasting nearly 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The final impact with the ocean, at more than 200 miles per hour, was devastating, producing forces far beyond survivability. And what they found inside the cabin would reveal details about the astronauts' final moments that the world had never imagined: the search for the crew's remains. When investigators opened the crushed remains of the crew cabin inside the secure hangar at Kennedy Space Center, the mission shifted from engineering to humanity. The people working there were no longer just handling wreckage. They were handling what remained of 7 lives dedicated to exploration. The atmosphere inside the building changed immediately. Voices dropped. Movement slowed. Every step was taken with deep respect. Among the twisted metal, shattered equipment, and collapsed interior walls, divers had found what NASA later described only as crew remains. The exact details were never released publicly, out of respect for the astronauts' families. Still, those involved later acknowledged that the remains were fragile, fragmented, and often intermingled. Weeks underwater had caused damage. Salt water, pressure, and time had made the task of identification incredibly difficult. The recovery team followed strict military protocols. Every fragment was photographed, tagged, and logged. Personal items were pulled aside for forensic analysis. The remains were transported to a private facility, widely believed to be at Patrick Air Force Base, where a team of pathologists, medical examiners, and forensic specialists began the painstaking process of examination. No media was allowed. No photographs were taken. NASA wanted to protect the dignity of the crew above anything else. This was 1986. DNA testing was not yet standard practice. Identification relied on more traditional and intimate methods: dental records, skeletal characteristics, and personal artifacts. Some fragments could be matched to individuals. Others could not be separated. Each new identification was documented with care, and families were quietly notified. According to Navy reports, by April 19, 1986, all 7 astronauts had been officially identified. This discovery suggested that at least some of the astronauts may have been conscious or regained consciousness briefly after the breakup. The cabin's violent depressurization would have knocked them out within seconds, but the possibility of even momentary awareness during the fall deeply affected the investigators. NASA's official biomedical report later explained that the precise moment of death could not be determined. The forces at ocean impact, however, were unquestionably fatal. Once the remains had been identified, families were given the choice to claim their loved ones for private burial. Those remains that could not be individually distinguished were cremated together. On May 20, 1986, in a quiet and private ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery, the commingled ashes of the Challenger crew were laid to rest beneath a simple white monument. But even after the crew was laid to rest, one question still demanded answers. How could a single, simple failure bring down a shuttle that millions believed was nearly indestructible? The investigation and NASA's reckoning. As the recovery of Challenger's wreckage and the crew's remains came to an end, the nation turned toward a new and urgent question. How could this have happened? President Ronald Reagan appointed a special commission to find the answer. It became known as the Rogers Commission, led by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers. The commission brought together some of the most respected minds in science, engineering, and aviation, including Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride. Their task was not only to uncover the cause of the disaster, but to reveal every failure that allowed it to occur. The technical findings came first. Engineers on the commission traced the disaster back to the right solid rocket booster, specifically the field joint between two cylindrical sections. This joint was sealed by two rubber O-rings designed to prevent hot gases from escaping during launch. But the launch day had been unusually cold. Far colder than any previous shuttle launch, overnight temperatures had dropped to levels that caused the O-rings to stiffen. Instead of flexing and sealing instantly, they froze, becoming slow to respond when the booster ignited. The commission confirmed what early video footage had shown. A small puff of black smoke appeared on the booster just seconds after liftoff. This smoke was the first sign that the O-ring had failed to seal properly. As the shuttle climbed, hot gas burned through the joint, widening the gap with each passing second. At 73 seconds into flight, flame from the booster pierced the external fuel tank, igniting the liquid hydrogen and oxygen inside. The tank ruptured, and Challenger broke apart. The Rogers Commission exposed a deeper, more troubling truth. The commission discovered that engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the solid rocket boosters, had warned NASA the night before launch that the cold could make the O-rings unsafe. Several engineers urged management to delay. They presented data showing past O-ring behavior in cold weather and argued that launching at such low temperatures was dangerously outside their safety envelope. The Rogers Commission report was blunt. It criticized NASA for flawed communication, poor judgment, and a lack of proper safety oversight. It demanded sweeping reforms, the redesign of the booster joints, new decision-making procedures, stricter safety standards, and a stronger independent safety office. The shuttle program was grounded for more than 2 years while changes were made. Inside NASA, the findings were devastating. The agency was forced to confront the painful reality that Challenger was not just lost to a technical flaw, it was lost to human error and systemic failure. Engineers who had once felt unheard were now encouraged to challenge decisions. Meetings became more open, checklists more detailed, and concerns were no longer dismissed as obstacles. When Discovery finally launched in 1988, marking the shuttle program's return to flight, the names of the Challenger crew were read aloud in a moment of silence. Their loss had reshaped NASA forever. Legacy, memory, and the fate of Challenger. In the months after the Rogers Commission released its findings, NASA faced one final responsibility: deciding how to preserve what remained of Challenger. Inside a restricted facility at Kennedy Space Center, engineers finished reconstructing the recovered sections of Challenger on a massive steel grid. This reconstruction was not for the public. It was for investigators, for future engineers, and for lessons that could never be forgotten. As the analysis concluded, NASA began quietly preparing the long-term storage site that would house the remains. Access was limited to a very small number of officials. The public would never see these materials. The most sensitive decision, however, involved the crew remains. Families had been notified privately, and those remains that could be identified were returned to their loved ones. For the fragments that could not be separated, the families collectively chose a dignified and unified resting place. On May 20, 1986, the commingled ashes of the Challenger astronauts were laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. The ceremony was private, attended by family members, NASA officials, and a handful of astronauts. There were no speeches for cameras, no reporters, no crowds. A folded flag, a solemn silence, and 7 names carved in stone marked the moment. As NASA rebuilt the shuttle program, the memory of Challenger became a guiding force. New safety protocols were introduced. Booster joints were redesigned with stronger seals and heaters to prevent cold-related failures. When the Space Shuttle Discovery launched in 1988, ending the 2-year grounding, the mission opened with a tribute to the lost crew. Their names were read, and a moment of silence filled the launch control room. Every astronaut who flew after Challenger carried their memory into space. In schools across America, the story of Christa McAuliffe continued to inspire generations of students. Her lesson plans, intended to be taught from orbit, were shared with classrooms nationwide. The Teacher in Space program was never revived, but its spirit lived on in educational outreach programs that grew in her honor. At Kennedy Space Center, the Space Mirror Memorial was updated to include the Challenger crew, ensuring their names would be illuminated by sunlight for generations. Each year on January 28th, NASA staff gather quietly to read those names aloud. The ceremony is small, somber, and deeply heartfelt. Some of the divers and engineers who worked on the recovery have attended these memorials, still carrying the weight of what they witnessed beneath the Atlantic. The remains of Challenger still rest in their secure facility, preserved not as relics of failure, but as reminders, silent, powerful, and eternal. Their existence ensures that the lessons of January 28, 1986, will never be forgotten. What are your thoughts on the Challenger story and the legacy it left behind? Share your thoughts in the comments.